What kind of judge orders a decorated combat veteran to take off her medal in the middle of a courtroom? I found out the answer, and by the end of that day, the same judge was the one being escorted out in handcuffs. If you have ever been underestimated by people who thought your silence meant weakness, hit like right now, subscribe before you scroll away, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight. This story earns every second of your time. My name is Rosemary Callahan. I am 34 years old. I spent 8 years in the Navy as a combat medic, and I carry a Navy Cross for something I still don't like talking about at dinner parties. When I came home, I built a quiet life. I run a small cybersecurity firm out of a converted carriage house behind the property my grandmother left me, a beautiful old brick house on a tree-lined street that has been in our family for 3 generations. I don't post about it online. I don't need anyone's approval to know what it's worth, both the house and the years of work I put into keeping it standing. My brother Derek married a woman named Vanessa about 4 years ago. Vanessa runs a wellness brand online, the kind with green juice photos and captions about healing your inner child. To her hundreds of thousands of followers, she is soft-spoken and spiritual. To the people who actually know her, she is something else entirely. Calculating, patient, the kind of person who smiles while she's taking notes on your weaknesses. I want to explain something about my family before I tell you what happened, because none of this makes sense without it. My parents always measured worth in visibility. My brother Derek never held a steady job for more than a year, but he looked successful, so nobody questioned him. I served my country, came home with injuries nobody could see, and built something real with my own 2 hands, and somehow that made me the difficult one. The one who didn't quite fit the family photo. When my grandmother passed, she left the brick house to me alone. She knew Derek would have sold it within a year to fund whatever scheme Vanessa had cooked up. My grandmother trusted me because I was the one who visited her every single Sunday for a decade, not because I asked for anything, but because I loved her. That became the center of a war I never asked for. It started on a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks before everything exploded. Vanessa showed up unannounced with a folder of documents and a photographer trailing behind her, supposedly there to capture some candid family content. She sat across from me at my own kitchen table and told me, quite calmly, that she needed the house. Her brand was expanding into a lifestyle line, she said, and she needed, in her words, a story-worthy home to film in. She suggested I sign the deed over to a shared family trust that, conveniently, she and Derek would control. I told her no. I told her politely, the way you tell someone something you assume they already understand. She did not take it well. Her smile didn't change, but something behind her eyes did, and I have spent enough time reading people under pressure to know when I am looking at someone recalculating. 2 weeks later, I was served with a lawsuit. Vanessa claimed I had coerced my grandmother into changing her will while she was mentally unwell. She claimed I had a pattern of, and I am quoting the filing here, unstable and aggressive behavior stemming from unresolved trauma from my military service. She attached a psychiatric evaluation that I had never taken from a doctor I had never met. She was building a public narrative before she ever built a legal one, because Vanessa understood something most people forget. In this day and age, you don't need real evidence. You just need enough noise to make people believe the noise is evidence. Within days, she posted a tearful video to her followers, without naming me directly, about family members who let trauma turn them cruel, about needing to protect her future children from instability. Her comments section filled with strangers sending her hearts and prayers. Nobody asked a single question. Nobody ever does when the story is packaged well enough. My clients started calling. 2 of them, both companies that required strict security clearances for the government contracts I worked on, told me they needed to pause our agreements until the, quote, personal matter was resolved. In less than a month, Vanessa's carefully edited video had cost me a significant portion of my income, all without a single fact being checked. I want to pause here and tell you something important, because I think a lot of you already know this feeling. The people who hurt you the most rarely do it with a weapon you can see coming. They do it with paperwork, with a camera, with a story told just convincingly enough that everyone around you starts looking at you a little differently. That is a particular kind of loneliness, and if you have felt it, you already understand exactly why I did what I did next. If this story feels familiar so far, drop a single word in the comments describing the person in your life who tried to rewrite your story for their own gain. I read every comment, and I promise you, you are far from alone in this. The court date arrived faster than I expected. The judge assigned to the case was a man named Harold Whitfield, a name I would come to know very well by the time this was over. Vanessa's lawyer was polished and expensive, the kind of attorney who bills more for a single afternoon than most people make in a month. My brother sat beside his wife in the gallery, unable to look at me, the same way he had avoided looking at me for most of our adult lives whenever a decision needed to be made about who deserved what. I represented myself, not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. I understood systems. I understood how information moves and how people build narratives out of selectively chosen facts, and I intended to use exactly that skill in that courtroom. The hearing began, and Vanessa's attorney painted the picture he had rehearsed. He described me as isolated, unstable, someone whose military service had left her paranoid and volatile, someone who manipulated a grieving elderly woman into signing away a family legacy. He called Vanessa to the stand, and she performed beautifully. Her voice cracked at all the right moments. She dabbed at dry eyes with a folded tissue. She said she only wanted peace for the family, that she was terrified of me, that she hoped one day I could get the help I clearly needed. Judge Whitfield nodded along with a sympathy that felt oddly rehearsed for a man who was supposed to be neutral. I noticed it immediately. Years of reading rooms under stress teaches you to notice when someone in power already knows which way they intend to lean. When it was my turn to speak, I stood and requested permission to enter evidence, financial documents I had quietly gathered showing that Vanessa's wellness brand was not the thriving small business her followers believed it to be. It was hemorrhaging money, propped up entirely by undisclosed loans and a series of unusual transfers to an account that did not belong to any registered business at all. I had barely gotten 3 sentences into my explanation when Judge Whitfield cut me off. He said the financial records were irrelevant to a competency dispute. Then his eyes moved to my chest, to the small bronze medal pinned above my blazer pocket, the one I wear on days that matter, because my grandmother asked me to wear it the day I inherited her house, and I had promised her I would. Judge Whitfield told me, in front of the entire courtroom, to remove it. He said it was inappropriate courtroom theater, an attempt to manipulate sympathy, and he would not allow what he called a costume to influence his ruling. I looked at him for a long moment. I did not raise my voice. I unpinned the Navy Cross slowly, the metal cool against my fingers, and I set it down on the table in front of me. Vanessa smiled. My brother finally looked up, and even he seemed uncomfortable with what he was witnessing. I want to tell you exactly what I was thinking in that moment because it was not anger. It was clarity. A man who felt the need to strip a veteran of a medal to control a courtroom was a man who was afraid of exactly what that medal represented, honesty backed by evidence. And I understood immediately that Judge Whitfield had far more to hide than a simple lack of professional courtesy. If you have ever watched someone in power use their authority to silence the wrong person, don't scroll past this next part. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that the truth always finds a way out, and stay with me, because what happened over the following days changed everything. Here is something I had not mentioned yet, something that would matter more than anyone in that courtroom could have guessed. Before the lawsuit was ever filed, I had already noticed strange activity trying to breach my company's servers, brute force attempts happening at odd hours, clumsy but persistent. In my line of work, that kind of activity rarely comes from strangers. It usually comes from someone who has a very personal reason to want access to what you know. I traced the attempts back through several proxy layers, and eventually, to my quiet astonishment, the trail led to an IP address registered to Vanessa's business manager, a man who, it turned out, also handled financial arrangements for several other clients in the city, including, remarkably, Judge Harold Whitfield. I did not go to the police immediately. I did something smarter. I documented everything, quietly, thoroughly, The way you learn to do when you understand that evidence gathered too early can be destroyed before anyone official ever sees it. I reached out to a former Navy colleague, a woman named Denise Acafo, who now worked in a financial crimes division at the federal level. We had trusted each other with our lives once, and that kind of trust does not expire. I sent her what I had found. She did not ask a single unnecessary question. She simply said, "Give me 48 hours." Those 48 hours changed the entire shape of the case. Denise called me back with a voice I recognized from years ago, calm on the surface, completely locked in underneath. She told me Vanessa's wellness brand was not simply struggling. It was a front, a shell business used to funnel money from a group of investors who believed they were funding a legitimate product line, when in reality, most of the funds were being redirected into personal accounts, including regular, unusually specific payments made every month to an account tied directly to Judge Whitfield. I sat with that information for a long moment. The judge presiding over my case, the same man who told me to remove a medal I earned bleeding for people I had never met, was quietly being paid by the same woman suing me. It explained the sympathy in his eyes during her performance on the stand. It explained the way he dismissed my financial evidence before I had even finished presenting it. This was never a fair hearing. It was a transaction wearing a robe. I want to be honest about something here because I think it matters. I did not feel triumphant in that moment. I felt a kind of quiet, cold sadness, the same sadness you feel when you finally understand the true shape of something you had hoped was smaller than it actually was. Corruption dressed in a black robe is still corruption. A family member willing to fabricate a mental health crisis to steal a house is still willing to hurt you in ways you never expected from someone who shares your last name. The next hearing was scheduled for the following week, and I walked in with a different plan entirely. I had not hired a flashy attorney. I did not need one. I had Denise, quietly seated in the back of the gallery, and I had a federal case number that had already been opened before the hearing even started, something Judge Whitfield had absolutely no idea about yet. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. If someone you trusted tried to use the system against you the way Vanessa did to me, would you have stayed quiet to keep the peace, or would you have fought back the way I did? Answer honestly in the comments, because I think the answer says more about a person than almost anything else. The second hearing began the same way the first one had, with Vanessa's attorney trying to establish a pattern of instability, referencing my military service like it was a diagnosis, rather than a chapter of service and sacrifice. Judge Whitfield allowed every leading question, every irrelevant insinuation, and dismissed every objection I raised with the same tired impatience as before. He clearly believed this hearing would end exactly like the first one had, with me quietly absorbing another blow. When it was my turn, I stood and asked the court for permission to introduce new evidence related to financial transactions connected to the plaintiff's business. Judge Whitfield sighed audibly and told me, once again, that financial matters were not relevant to a competency hearing, and that he would not tolerate what he called a fishing expedition. I asked him plainly whether he was aware that the plaintiff's business manager had made 12 separate transfers over the past year to an account registered under his own name. The courtroom went completely silent. Vanessa's face went pale in a way that no amount of practiced composure could hide. Judge Whitfield's expression cracked for just a moment before he regained control, insisting I was making a baseless and defamatory accusation, threatening me with contempt if I continued. I did not raise my voice. I simply nodded toward the back of the courtroom, where Denise stood and calmly introduced herself, along with 2 federal agents who had been quietly waiting outside for exactly this moment. She explained, in clear and measured language, that a federal investigation into financial fraud and judicial bribery had already been underway for the past several days, and that today's hearing would be the last one Judge Whitfield would preside over for a very long time. The room erupted into chaos in the particular hushed, frantic way courtrooms do, whispers rippling through the gallery, Vanessa's attorney standing up so fast his chair toppled backward, my brother sitting frozen with his hands pressed to his face. Judge Whitfield attempted to assert his authority, banging his gavel and demanding order, But authority built on corruption collapses the moment the truth is finally louder than the silence protecting it. Federal agents approached the bench, and within minutes, the man who had ordered me to remove a medal earned through actual sacrifice was being escorted out of his own cur. Troom in handcuffs, stripped of the robe that had given him the illusion of untouchable power. Vanessa did not wait to see the rest unfold. She bolted for the side exit, her polished composure completely abandoned, but 2 federal agents intercepted her before she reached the door. It turned out the investigation into her financial dealings extended far beyond a single corrupt judge. Denise later told me that Vanessa had been running this exact playbook with more than one target, manufacturing sympathetic narratives online, while quietly bleeding investors dry behind the scenes, protected by a judge who received a comfortable monthly fee to make inconvenient lawsuits disappear in her favor. My brother Derek stayed seated long after everyone else had left, staring at his hands like they belonged to a stranger. When he finally looked up at me, there was no apology ready on his lips, only a kind of hollow disbelief, the look of a man realizing that the life he had built his identity around was made almost entirely of borrowed light. I did not gloat. I did not need to. I picked my Navy Cross up off the evidence table where it had been sitting since that first hearing, and I pinned it back onto my blazer exactly where it belonged. Then I walked out of that courtroom without looking back, because for the first time in months, I did not need anyone's approval to know exactly who I was. Here is the part I think matters most, the part that happened quietly in the weeks after all the noise settled. Vanessa was formally charged with multiple counts of financial fraud and conspiracy, and her wellness brand collapsed within days once her followers learned the truth. Judge Whitfield was removed from the bench, stripped of his position, and now faces his own lengthy list of federal charges related to bribery and obstruction. My brother Derek did not go to prison, but he lost nearly everything Vanessa had built around him: the house they rented to look successful, the borrowed car, the carefully staged photos that made their life look like something it never actually was. He called me a few weeks later, his voice smaller than I had heard it in years. He asked, quietly, if there was any chance we could rebuild something between us. I did not give him an easy answer. I told him honestly that trust is not something you get back simply because the person who deceived you got caught. I told him if he wanted a relationship with me again, it would have to be built slowly, with actions, not apologies made only after consequences arrived. He said he understood. I hope, for both our sakes, that he actually did. My grandmother's house is still mine, untouched by any of it, standing exactly where it has stood for 3 generations. I still work Sundays in the same kitchen where Vanessa once slid a folder across the table and asked me to give away everything my grandmother trusted me to protect. Some mornings, I sit at that table with my coffee, and I think about how close I came to losing it all, not because I had done anything wrong, but because someone decided the truth was less useful to them than a convincing lie. If there is one thing I want you to take from this story, it is this. People who are confident in their own worth rarely need to destroy someone else's, and people who resort to fabricated stories, manufactured sympathy, and quiet corruption to take what isn't theirs are almost always standing on far less solid ground than they want you to believe. The loudest performance in the room is very often hiding the weakest position. I kept my house. I kept my company. I kept the medal I earned, and more importantly, I kept the version of myself that refuses to shrink just because someone else needs me to be smaller for their story to make sense. If someone in your life has ever tried to rewrite the truth to take something that was never theirs, tell me about it in the comments below. I read every single one, and I promise you, your story matters just as much as mine did.